Reddit. I've never told anyone this before, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. It's been eating at me since that night, clawing at the edges of my mind. 2 years ago, I saw something I can't explain, something I'll never forget. It all started a few weeks before our annual family camping trip. I was sitting on my back porch, scrolling through my phone, the night sky sprawling above me like a vast, indifferent canvas. That's when I saw them. At first, they looked like satellites, tiny pinprick lights drifting lazily across the stars. But then one of them zigzagged, its movement so sharp and deliberate that I froze. The others followed, weaving intricate, impossible patterns. They moved like fireflies, but faster, smarter, like they had a purpose I couldn't begin to fathom. My breath hitched as I watched, my skin prickling with the eerie sensation that I was witnessing something I shouldn't. I told myself it was drones, some kind of light show or military tech. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next week, I saw them again and again. 4 more times, always at night, always in the same strange, intelligent patterns. I couldn't stop thinking about them, and of course I made the mistake of telling people. At work, over drinks with friends, I became the UFO guy. The jokes came fast and relentless, and while I laughed along, it stung. Hey, did they beam you up yet? Watch out, they might probe you next time. And I tried to let it roll off my back, but it was enough to shut me up. I stopped bringing it up, stopped looking up at the sky when anyone else was around. It was easier that way. 2 weeks later, we went on our family camping trip, just like we always did. The woods were quiet, the air thick with the earthy smell of damp leaves and pine. We set up our tents, cracked open beers, and gathered around the fire as the stars blinked awake overhead. For a while, it was like any other year. Sheep laughs, burnt marshmallows, the comforting warmth of the flames. My cousin Sarah, always the loudest, grinned at me from across the fire. "So, UFO guy," she said, holding up a marshmallow like it was a microphone. "Did they look like this? Little glowing balls flying around all crazy like?" The laughter rippled through the group, and my face burned as I forced a smile. "I'm just saying," I muttered. "They weren't satellites." Sure, Sarah teased. "Maybe they were alien fireflies, huh?" More laughter. I wanted to snap back, but before I could, the fire died. Not gradually, like it was running out of fuel, but all at once, like someone had hit a switch. The laughter faded into uneasy silence, and the air around us seemed to tighten. That's when it happened. A single light, no bigger than a star, streaked across the sky above us. It stopped abruptly, hanging there like it was watching us. Then it split into 3 smaller lights, each darting in a different direction before rejoining in perfect unison. My heart pounded as I pointed upward, my voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "Just like that," I said. "Right there." No one laughed. No one said a word. We all just stared as the lights performed their impossible dance, their movements so precise and deliberate that it made my stomach churn. They moved like they had a mind of their own, like they knew we were watching. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The fire sputtered back to life, its flickering glow casting long, jittery shadows on the trees. No one spoke about what we'd seen. We just sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. Eventually, one by one, we retreated to our tents. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of nylon above me, my mind racing. I wanted to feel vindicated. No more UFO jokes, that was for sure. But instead, all I felt was dread. The next morning, everyone acted like nothing had happened. Sarah made pancakes on the portable griddle, and my uncle grumbled about his bad back, just like he did every year. But no one looked at the sky, and no one mentioned the lights. I didn't bring it up either. What could I say? That I thought those lights weren't just random phenomena? That they might actually be watching us? It sounded insane, even to me. And that night, I woke suddenly, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, but then I heard it, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The campsite was deathly quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Just that, and then I saw them again. The lights were back, but this time they were closer, much closer. They hovered just above the treetops, their glow casting an otherworldly light on the forest floor. My breath caught as one of the lights broke away from the group, descending slowly until it hovered no more than 10 feet in front of me. It wasn't just a light, it was a machine, sleek and metallic, its surface rippling like liquid mercury. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull, and I felt an unnatural warmth radiating from it. My knees trembled, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. For a moment, everything was still. And then, as if responding to some unseen command, the machine emitted a low, resonant tone. My vision blurred, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. When I came to, the lights were gone, and the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The campsite was as it had been, the others still asleep in their tents. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I wanted to wake them, to tell them what I'd seen, but the words died in my throat. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? We packed up later that morning, the trip ending like it always did, with hugs and promises to do it again next year. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving that forest behind. It had followed me, somehow. Even now, 2 years later, I wake some nights to the sound of that low hum vibrating through my bones. On clear nights, when I step outside and look up at the stars, I swear I see them. Tiny pinpricks of light, moving in impossible patterns, watching. I don't know what they are or what they want, but I know one thing for sure. They're not satellites. I've never been one to buy into conspiracy theories. Aliens, UFOs, government cover-ups. It all seemed like the stuff of late-night TV and internet rabbit holes. But one night in Afghanistan changed everything. I still don't know what I saw or what it meant, but I know one thing: it wasn't a glitch. When you're deployed, especially in a place as unforgiving as Afghanistan, boredom becomes a way of life. Most nights were spent sitting in a dusty outpost, staring at screens or the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony. My usual gig was assisting the operator of the Raven, a small, hand-launched UAV equipped with an infrared camera. The Raven was a lifesaver, letting us scan the roads for insurgents planting IEDs. It wasn't glamorous work, but it saved lives. Most nights were uneventful. Most nights, nothing happened. That night started like any other. The air was dry, thick with the smell of dust and diesel. The only sounds were the hum of generators and the occasional crackle of static over the comms. The operator, a guy we called McCall, was flying the Raven, and I was sitting next to him, squinting at the grainy feed on the Toughbook laptop. The screen showed the familiar landscape. Rocky terrain, winding dirt roads, patches of shrubs. We were scanning a stretch of road outside the wire, our eyes peeled for anything unusual. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow in the corner of the screen, a circular hot spot that didn't belong. The Raven's infrared camera picks up heat signatures, so we were used to seeing animals, vehicles, even the occasional stray dog. But this was different. It was perfectly round, glowing white, hot on the edges and pitch black in the center, like some kind of inverted eclipse. It wasn't moving, just hovering there, an unnatural anomaly against the cold, featureless landscape. "What the hell is that?" McCall muttered, leaning closer to the screen. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. We both stared at the feed, our minds racing. The thing wasn't giving off any identifiable signature. No heat trails, no motion, no flicker to suggest it was a fire or a malfunctioning piece of equipment. Just a smooth, glowing sphere, completely out of place. McCall adjusted the Raven's altitude, bringing it closer. The camera zoomed in, and the object came into sharper focus. It was unnervingly smooth, almost metallic in texture, but with no reflections, no discernible seams or features. The black heart of the sphere seemed to absorb the infrared, a void so dark it hurt my eyes to look at it. We hovered the Raven about 1,600 feet above ground level, circling the object, trying to get a better view. "What do you think?" McCall asked, his voice tight. I shook my head. "I don't know, maybe some kind of tech? A drone?" McCall didn't look convinced. Neither was I. We watched it for 5 minutes, the object remaining eerily still, as if it was studying us as much as we were studying it. Then, without warning, it moved. It didn't drift or wobble like a balloon or a drone caught in the wind. It moved with purpose, descending rapidly toward the ground. The movement was so sudden and precise that McCall cursed under his breath, struggling to keep the Raven's camera trained on it. The sphere dropped almost to ground level, then shot back up, streaking upward at an impossible speed. Within seconds, it was gone, disappearing into the night sky and out of the raven's range. "What the hell was that?" McCall said again, louder this time. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, my palms sweaty. My gut told me we'd just seen something we weren't supposed to. We called the TOC, Tactical Operations Center, to report the sighting. The guy on the other end of the line sounded unimpressed. "Probably a glitch," he said. "Infrared picks up weird stuff all the time, animals, heat plumes. Don't worry about it." "It wasn't a glitch," McCall snapped. "We saw it move. It wasn't random." The TOC wasn't interested. They had no satellite imagery from the area, nothing unusual to report. As far as they were concerned, we were making a fuss over nothing. Frustrated, we signed off and turned back to the tough book, eager to review the footage and prove what we'd seen. But when we pulled up the video feed, the 5 minutes where the object had appeared were gone. Not corrupted, not blurry, gone. As if they'd never existed. McCall and I stared at the screen in disbelief. The footage before and after was perfectly intact, showing the same rocky landscape, the same unremarkable roads. But the part we needed, the proof of what we'd seen, was missing. "How is that possible?" I whispered. McCall shook his head, his face pale. It's not possible." We sat there in stunned silence, the hum of the tough book the only sound in the room. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the weight of the moment sinking in. Someone, or something, didn't want us to have that footage. Over the next few days, we tried to talk about it, to make sense of what had happened. But every theory we came up with felt flimsy, inadequate. A glitch didn't explain the sphere's movements. A drone didn't explain the missing footage. And the more we thought about it, the more questions we had. Why was it there? What was it doing? And why had it left when it did? The TOC dismissed our concerns, chalking it up to equipment failure. Officially, the incident was logged as a non-event, just another quiet night in the desert. But McCall and I knew better. We knew what we'd seen. For the rest of my deployment, I couldn't shake the memory of that sphere. I found myself scanning the skies whenever I was outside, half hoping, half dreading that I'd see it again. But it never came back. When I finally got home, I tried to leave it behind to focus on rebuilding my life. But even now, years later, it haunts me. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels too big, I think about that glowing sphere, its smooth, featureless surface, the way it moved with such deliberate precision. I think about the missing footage, the silence from the TOC, the way the air seemed to hum with the strange, unspoken energy that night. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was some advanced tech, a classified experiment, or something not of this world, but I do know one thing: it wasn't a glitch. Redditor 3. I still remember that night vividly. It wasn't particularly special, just one of those quiet evenings when the world slows down and you can actually hear yourself think. I'd gone outside to escape the humdrum monotony of my day, looking for the kind of peace you can only find beneath a wide open sky. There's something humbling about staring up at the stars. Little did I know, I was about to get a first-hand reminder of just how strange and mysterious it can be. I was leaning back in my rickety old lawn chair, a cool breeze brushing against my skin. The air smelled faintly of damp grass, and the soft chirp of crickets provided a gentle soundtrack. The sky was clear, a deep indigo canvas dotted with stars. I've always loved watching airplanes glide silently overhead, their blinking lights tracing slow, predictable arcs across the heavens. That's what I thought I was seeing at first, a plane, nothing more. It was just a single point of light at the edge of the horizon, bright and steady, moving in a way that seemed entirely ordinary. I didn't pay it much attention at first, my thoughts drifting aimlessly. But then, something changed. The light began to move faster, darting in ways no plane ever could. It wasn't a straight, measured trajectory, it was erratic, yet precise, weaving patterns in the sky like an artist drawing with light. My heart began to race as I sat up straighter, my eyes locked onto it. It wasn't blinking like an airplane beacon, it was pulsing, a rhythmic glow that seemed almost alive. I tried to convince myself it was just some new type of aircraft, maybe a military jet or a drone. But the way it moved didn't make sense. It was too fluid, too controlled, as if it were defying the very laws of physics. It zigged and zagged, looped and spiraled, covering vast distances in an instant. The longer I watched, the harder it became to rationalize. Then, without warning, it stopped. It was as if the entire sky had frozen in that moment. The light hung there, utterly motionless, suspended against the infinite backdrop of stars. I held my breath, waiting for it to move again, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then it did, so suddenly and so fast that I nearly fell out of my chair. It shot backward, retracing its path with a speed that made my stomach lurch. I've seen jets breaking the sound barrier before, their contrails slicing the sky like a knife, followed by the thunderous crack of their sonic booms. But this? There was no sound, no trail, nothing to mark its passage except the sheer impossibility of what I was witnessing. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, faster than I thought anything could move. And then it was gone. It disappeared in a flash of light, a tiny sparkle that blinked out almost as soon as it appeared. For a brief, surreal moment, it reminded me of those old Pokemon cartoons I used to watch as a kid, the way Team Rocket would vanish into the sky with a gleaming twinkle. Except this wasn't a cartoon. This was real, and I was left staring at the empty patch of sky where the light had been, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. The night was eerily quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The crickets had stopped chirping, and even the breeze seemed to have stilled. It was just me and the stars and the faint memory of that impossible light. I tried to replay it in my head, to analyze every detail, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. What kind of technology could do that? Could it even be technology? I'd always considered myself a skeptic when it came to UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters. It's not that I didn't want to believe, I just didn't see any compelling evidence. But this was different. It wasn't a story I'd read on the internet or a blurry video on YouTube. It was something I'd seen with my own eyes, something I couldn't explain. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a drone, some advanced prototype being tested by the military. But why here, in the middle of nowhere? And why would it move like that? Drones don't stop on a dime and shoot off faster than the eye can track. They don't vanish in tiny flashes of light. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, I thought, though I didn't know of any that could behave that way. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I scoured the internet, reading about everything from experimental aircraft to ball lightning to UFO sightings. None of it felt right. The descriptions I found didn't match what I'd seen, and I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But it felt so real, so vivid. I could still see the light darting across the sky in my mind, still feel the jolt of shock when it vanished. I didn't tell anyone at first. What would I even say? Hey, I think I saw a UFO last night? People would laugh, or worse, they'd nod politely and change the subject, the same way you do when someone tells you something you don't quite believe but don't want to challenge. So I kept it to myself, turning it over and over in my mind, searching for answers that never came. Eventually, I did mention it to a close friend, someone I trusted not to judge me. He listened quietly as I described what I'd seen, his brow furrowing as he tried to process it. When I finished, he just shrugged and said, "Well, the universe is a pretty big place. Who knows what's out there?" It was a comforting thought in a way. The universe is vast, filled with wonders we can't even begin to comprehend. Maybe what I saw that night was just one of them. Something extraordinary, glimpsed for a fleeting moment before it disappeared into the great unknown. Even now, years later, I still think about that light. I find myself scanning the skies on clear nights, hoping to catch another glimpse of something impossible. Part of me hopes I never see it again. Part of me is terrified that I might. But one thing is certain, whatever it was, whatever I saw that night, it changed the way I look at the world and the stars above it. Forever. Redditor 4. I was 9 years old when I had the strangest experience of my life, an experience I've never been able to fully explain or forget. We were on a family trip to Gstaad, Switzerland, a picturesque mountain town that looked like something out of a postcard, the kind of place with rolling green meadows, jagged peaks capped with snow, and wooden chalets that seemed too quaint to be real. My parents loved hiking, so naturally they dragged the rest of us along, uncles, aunts, cousins, and all. It was a bright, sunny day, the kind that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen. We'd been hiking for hours, my legs aching and my stomach growling, when someone finally suggested we take a break. We found a clearing off the trail, nestled among a cluster of tall pines, and unpacked our lunch. While the adults were busy setting up, me and two of my cousins, Leo and Carla, decided to wander off. It didn't take long before we stumbled across something unusual. Hidden among the trees were several round holes, each about the size of a basketball, scattered across the ground like some strange constellation. The holes were perfectly circular, their edges sharp and clean, as though someone had carved them into the earth with a giant drill. But what struck us the most was how impossibly dark they were. No light penetrated their depths. It was as if they swallowed it whole. Being kids, our curiosity outweighed our caution. "I bet it's a secret tunnel," Leo said, crouching next to one of the holes. "Or maybe there's treasure down there," Carla added, her eyes lighting up. We decided to test the depth of the holes by throwing rocks inside. I grabbed a fist-sized stone and tossed it into the nearest one, listening closely. But there was no sound, no clatter, no echo, nothing. It was like the stone had vanished into thin air. We tried again, this time with a larger rock, same result. "It's bottomless," Leo said, grinning like he'd just solved some great mystery. But then something happened that wiped the grin off his face. Just as Carla was about to throw another rock, a voice emerged from one of the holes. It wasn't faint or distant like you'd expect from something so deep. It was clear, loud, and guttural, speaking in a language none of us understood. The three of us froze, our eyes darting to each other, silently asking the same question. "Did you hear that too?" Leo, being the oldest and perhaps the most foolish, knelt down and called into the hole. "Hello? Who's down there?" The voice responded almost immediately, barking something in its harsh alien tongue. It didn't sound friendly. Carla clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is it saying?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my mouth dry. Leo, undeterred, kept talking. "We're just exploring. Who are you?" The voice answered again, louder this time, the guttural words echoing through the clearing. It sounded angry, or maybe just impatient. It was impossible to tell. That's when we decided we'd had enough. Without a word, the three of us bolted back to the clearing where our parents were. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When we breathlessly told them what had happened, their reactions were mixed. Some of the adults laughed, dismissing it as childish imagination, but my Uncle Hans, a stoic man who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say, grew serious. "It's the Burgist," he said, his voice low. "The what?" I asked, confused. "The Burgist," he repeated. "A mountain spirit. They say it lives under the mountains, guarding the land. It doesn't like to be disturbed." My mother frowned. "Hans, don't scare them with stories." But Hans wasn't smiling. "It's not a story," he said. "The old people in these parts believe in it. You should too." The rest of the adults waved him off, but his words stayed with me. On the hike back down, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone emerging from the forest. I didn't know if I believed in the Burgist, but I knew what I'd heard, and whatever it was, it didn't feel like something I wanted to cross paths with again. Years later, I tried to research the Burgist, hoping to find some logical explanation. The legends were vague, describing it as a protector of the mountains, a spirit that punished those who disrespected the land. Some stories said it was benevolent, a guardian watching over travelers. Others painted it as a vengeful entity that lured the careless to their doom. None of it made me feel any closer to understanding what we encountered that day. To this day, I can't explain the holes, the voice, or the way it made me feel. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those dark, bottomless pits in the earth and wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd thrown just one more rock. Whatever was down there, I don't think it wanted to be found. Redditor 5. The drive through the South Australian desert was the kind of endless stretch of monotony that made you forget time altogether. Red dirt stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by scraggly bushes and the occasional weather-worn tree. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the kind of golden light that made even the barren land look beautiful. I was behind the wheel, the hum of the car engine a soothing constant, while my friend Jake snored softly in the passenger seat. We'd been on the road for hours, and the silence had settled into a comfortable rhythm, broken only by the occasional crow cawing in the distance. I had long since given up trying to entertain myself with the radio, and my eyes were locked on the horizon, scanning for anything to break the monotony. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another kangaroo darting out from the bushes, but as it moved further into the open, I realized it wasn't hopping, it was running. It was sleek, black, and unmistakably feline. The shape, the way it moved, the fluidity of its stride, there was no mistaking it. It was a panther. The animal stopped in the middle of the road, standing there with a kind of effortless confidence that sent a shiver up my spine. Its coat gleamed in the dying sunlight, and for a moment it looked directly at the car, its golden eyes catching the light. I froze, unsure of whether to brake, honk, or do nothing at all. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a part of me felt like I was seeing something I shouldn't, something that didn't belong here. "Jake," I hissed, reaching over to shake his shoulder. "Jake, wake up. You need to see this." He stirred, grumbling as he rubbed his eyes, but by the time he sat up and looked around, the panther had already turned and darted back into the bushes. Its movement so smooth and quick it seemed to melt into the landscape. The road ahead was empty again, as though it had never been there at all. "What is it?" Jake muttered, still groggy. "I just saw a panther," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "A black panther, right there in the middle of the road." Jake gave me a skeptical look, then leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes again. "You've been staring at this road too long, mate. Probably just a kangaroo or a shadow or something. There aren't any big cats in Australia, remember?" "I know what I saw," I snapped, but he was already dozing off again, unconvinced. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't get the image of the panther out of my head. The way it had looked at me, the way it moved. It wasn't something I could just brush off. By the time we reached our destination, I'd replayed the moment in my mind so many times that I'd started to doubt myself. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, a shadow, or just my imagination filling in the blanks during a long, boring drive. But deep down, I knew better. When I got back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I started doing some research, digging through forums and obscure websites, and that's when I discovered that I wasn't alone. Dozens of people had reported seeing big cats in Australia, particularly in remote areas of South and Western Australia. Black panthers, mountain lions, even tigers. The stories were always met with skepticism from authorities, dismissed as urban legends or mistaken identity, but the descriptions were eerily consistent. Large black cats, moving with a predatory grace, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Some theories suggested that they were escaped pets, remnants of private collections or circuses from decades past. Others claimed they were a cryptid species, something native to the land but hidden so well that no one had ever confirmed their existence. A few even whispered about military experiments or animals brought over by settlers that had somehow adapted to the wild. None of it made sense, but it made me feel less alone, knowing I wasn't the only one who had seen something inexplicable. Years passed, but the memory of the panther stayed with me, a lingering question mark in the back of my mind. I didn't talk about it much, except with a few close friends, and even then I could tell they didn't believe me. Their polite smiles and nods said it all. They thought I was either imagining things or exaggerating a story for attention. It didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. I didn't need them to believe me. I knew what I had seen. One day, during another long drive through the outback, I found myself scanning the horizon again, my eyes darting to every patch of bushes and every shadow on the road. The memory of the panther had made me hyper-aware, always half expecting to catch another glimpse of something impossible. But as the hours passed and the road stretched on, there was nothing. Just more heat waves and empty land. By the time I reached my destination, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. That night, as I lay in bed, I dreamed of the panther. In the dream, it wasn't afraid. It didn't dart away into the bushes. It approached the car, its golden eyes locking onto mine as it walked slowly, deliberately, stopping just a few feet away. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or even breathe as it stared at me, its presence overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. When I woke up, my heart was pounding. and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a dream. Even now, years later, I still think about that day. I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. Whatever it was, escaped pet, cryptid, or something else entirely, it's out there, moving through the wild, untamed parts of Australia, where the impossible feels just a little closer to reality. Redditor 6. I never really knew my dad growing up. I'd met him a handful of times, but our relationship was more of an occasional acquaintance than anything else. He wasn't a bad man, just distant, the kind of person who kept his life simple and self-contained. When I did visit him, I always got the impression he was more at home in the middle of nowhere than he ever would be in a bustling city or a crowded room. He lived out in rural Victoria, not too far from the Strzelecki Ranges, the kind of place where dirt roads outnumber paved ones and the air smells perpetually of eucalyptus and damp earth. I'd heard rumors about the area, stories of a big cat supposedly roaming the bushland, escaped from a zoo maybe, or a circus, or even a private collection. It sounded like one of those tales that got passed around local pubs to spice up an otherwise uneventful evening. I never gave it much thought, and neither, it seemed, had my dad. The last time I visited him, he'd recently inherited a couple of animals, a black lab mix named Molly and a single cow. Molly was one of those dogs that made everyone fall in love with her immediately, sleek, friendly, and full of energy. She followed my dad everywhere, her tail wagging so hard it seemed to power her whole body. The cow, on the other hand, was just a cow, quiet, lumbering, and mostly content to graze on the acres of bushland that surrounded his house. One evening, my dad came home to find a group of people gathered by his mailbox. This struck him as odd. His driveway was long, lined with trees and bushes, and the road it connected to wasn't exactly pedestrian-friendly. He walked down to greet them, curious about what they were doing there. When he asked, the group immediately launched into an excited explanation. They'd seen something, a huge black cat, waist-high at least, darting into the bushes. They were adamant about what they'd seen, pointing toward the tree line and talking over each other in their excitement. My dad, ever the pragmatist, thought they were being ridiculous. It's probably just a dog, he told them, chuckling at their dramatics. And as if on cue, Molly came bounding out of the bushes, her sleek black coat glinting in the fading light. The group screamed, pointing and shouting, convinced Molly was the big cat they'd seen. My dad laughed, shaking his head as he patted Molly's head. "This is my dog," he told them. "She's not a bloody panther." The group, embarrassed but still rattled, eventually left, muttering about what they'd seen and how sure they were it wasn't a dog. That night, my dad chuckled to himself about the incident. He'd always been a no-nonsense kind of man, not one to believe in ghosts or cryptids or any of that sort of thing. The idea of a big cat roaming the bush seemed absurd to him. Molly, too, seemed unbothered, curling up on the porch and falling asleep without a care in the world. The next night, though, things took a strange turn. My dad was working behind the house, tinkering with something in his shed, when Molly suddenly came tearing toward him from the direction of the bushland. Her ears were flat against her head, and her eyes were wide with fear. She bolted straight past him without so much as a glance and dove under the house, her body trembling as she pressed herself into the shadows. He tried coaxing her out, calling her name and offering treats, but she wouldn't budge. She'd never acted like that before. Molly was fearless, the kind of dog that barked at kangaroos and chased birds without a second thought. Whatever had scared her had done a thorough job of it. Concerned, my dad grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the paddock where his cow grazed. The paddock was quiet, eerily so. The usual sounds of the bush, crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of leaves, were absent. It was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He found the cow standing still, staring toward the tree line. She didn't seem injured, but something about her stance was off. Rigid, tense, like she was waiting for something to happen. My dad decided to bring her closer to the house just in case. As he was leading her back, he heard it. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard before. A deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was so loud it made his chest vibrate, and for a moment he froze, unsure of what to do. He'd lived in the bush for most of his life, traveled all over Australia, and considered himself familiar with its wildlife. But this? He turned his flashlight toward the trees, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The beam of light danced across the trunks and branches, but nothing moved. The roar came again, closer this time, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. Grabbing his phone, he called a friend, someone who knew the area well, hoping for an explanation. The friend was just as puzzled as he was. They talked about dingoes, wild dogs, even feral pigs, but nothing fit the description of the sound. "Could be the big cat those people were talking about," his friend joked, though there was an edge of unease in his voice. After that night, my dad didn't take any chances. He kept Molly and the cow close to the house, never letting them wander too far into the bush. He didn't hear the sound again, but the memory of it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his skepticism. He started keeping a rifle handy, just in case, though he'd never admit it was because of the big cat. When he told me the story later, I could see how much it had unsettled him. He wasn't the kind of person to make things up or exaggerate, and he told the story matter-of-factly like he was recounting a trip to the store. "I don't know what it was," he said, "but it wasn't normal, I'll tell you that much." Since then, I've looked into the rumors about big cats in Australia. There are plenty of stories, sightings, even blurry photos and shaky videos. Some people think it's all a myth, but others are convinced there's something out there. After hearing my dad's story, I'm not so sure it's just a myth. Whatever's roaming the bush, it's big, it's black, and it's not a dog. Redditor 7. There's a spot off the southwestern coast of Western Australia where my family has been fishing for generations. It's a rugged, windswept place where the waves crash against jagged cliffs and the air smells of salt and seaweed. It's beautiful in its isolation, the kind of place that feels untouched by time. For as long as anyone can remember, it's been our family's retreat, a place to fish, to tell stories, and apparently, to witness the unexplainable. I first heard about the lights when I was a kid, sitting around a campfire with my dad and my uncles, the crackle of burning wood mingling with the distant roar of the ocean. They talked about them casually, like they were discussing the weather or the tides. My great-great-grandfather had been the first to see them, back in the 1920s. He described them as balls of light, purple and green, zipping through the night sky. He swore they weren't natural, that they moved too fast, too deliberately, to be anything ordinary. "It's like someone's driving them," he used to say, though no one knew what he meant by that. Over the years, everyone in the family had their own stories. My grandfather told me about the time he'd been out night fishing and seen a light hover over the water so bright it turned the waves a glowing shade of green. My dad swore he'd watched one shoot straight up into the sky, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Even my cousins, who were usually too busy with their phones to notice much of anything, claimed they'd seen the lights once during a camping trip. The first time I saw them for myself, I was 17. It was one of those perfectly still nights when the ocean seemed to stretch forever, the horizon barely distinguishable from the sky. I'd stayed out late, casting lines into the dark water, the rhythmic lapping of the waves the only sound. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flash of purple light just above the water. I turned, my heart suddenly racing, and there it was, a glowing orb the size of a basketball, hovering a few meters above the surface. It pulsed gently, shifting from purple to green and back again, casting an eerie light on the surrounding water. I froze, my fishing rod forgotten as it began to move. It didn't drift like something caught in the wind, it darted, fast and precise, tracing patterns in the air like it had a mind of its own. I don't know how long I stood there, watching. Time seemed to stretch and blur, my senses hyper-focused on the strange, beautiful light. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it shot upward, vanishing into the night sky without a sound. When I got back to camp, I told my dad what I'd seen. He just nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "Told you they're real," he said, as if there'd never been any doubt. Since then, I've seen the lights a handful of times, and every time feels as surreal and inexplicable as the first. They always appear at night, usually when the ocean is calm. Sometimes they hover over the water, pulsing gently, their colors shifting in hypnotic patterns. Other times they move with incredible speed, zipping across the sky or diving into the ocean without a splash. Once, I saw 3 of them at the same time, dancing around each other in a coordinated display that seemed almost playful. I've tried to make sense of them, to find a logical explanation. Theories about ball lightning or plasma phenomena come to mind. And I've read about similar sightings in other parts of the world. Scientists have studied these phenomena, attributing them to natural processes like electrical discharges or atmospheric conditions. But none of that quite fits what I've seen. The lights don't behave like random bursts of energy. They're too deliberate, too purposeful. There are other theories, of course. Some people believe they're UFOs, piloted by beings from another world. My family, despite their years of experience with the lights, doesn't dwell on the why. For them, it's just part of the landscape, like the cliffs and the waves. They've been here longer than we have, my dad once said. No point in trying to figure it out. I've come to accept that I may never know what the lights are or where they come from. But there's something comforting about their presence, something almost magical. They remind me of how vast and mysterious the world is, how much there is that we still don't understand. Now, whenever I visit the old fishing spot, I find myself scanning the horizon after dark, hoping for another glimpse of the lights. Sometimes they show up, and sometimes they don't, but when they do, I'm reminded of the stories my family has passed down for nearly a century, of the strange, beautiful phenomena that have made our little corner of the world feel just a bit more extraordinary. Redditor 8. It was one of those rare vacations when the family decided to do something different. We rented a cabin by a lake in Minnesota, the kind of place where the water stretches endlessly, framed by trees that seem to scrape the sky. I was 13 at the time, and my older sister, 24, had tagged along. She was glued to her phone most of the time, half engaged with the rest of us, but I didn't mind. The lake itself was mesmerizing, clear and calm, its surface like a perfect sheet of glass. I found myself spending hours on the dock, staring into the water, watching the fish move below the surface. That afternoon, I had taken the small aluminum boat tied near the dock and paddled a short distance from shore. The air was warm, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and makes the world feel smaller. My sister sat cross-legged on the dock, absorbed in her phone, while I sat in the boat, leaning over the side and looking down. The fish darted around in patterns I didn't fully understand, reacting to the smallest movements. I entertained myself by dropping small objects into the water, watching the ripples spread out in perfect circles. The fish would scatter instinctively, not at the objects themselves, but at the disturbance on the surface. It fascinated me, how they seemed so attuned to the environment, their movements graceful and deliberate. After a while, I noticed something in the boat that caught my attention. It was an old anchor-like object, heavy and rusted, with a flat metal plate at its base and a short pillar in the center where a rope had been tied. The rope looked frayed and weathered, as though it had been left out in the elements for years. Without thinking much of it, I grabbed the anchor and heaved it over the side, watching it sink into the water with a satisfying splash. It wasn't until the rope began disappearing into the depths that I realized it wasn't tied to anything on the other end. I felt a brief pang of regret. What if someone needed that anchor? But that regret was quickly replaced by something else entirely. As the anchor vanished into the water, the surface began to shift. At first, it was subtle, like the ripples I'd seen when I dropped pebbles earlier. But then the movement grew more pronounced, the water trembling as if something enormous was stirring beneath it. A faint rushing sound filled the air, low and deep, like a distant windstorm, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I backed away instinctively, my eyes fixed on the spot where the anchor had disappeared. Suddenly, the water erupted. A massive column of water shot into the air, twisting and writhing as it rose. It wasn't like a splash or even a geyser. It moved with a deliberate energy, as though something was forcing it upward. The plume was enormous, taller than anything I'd ever seen, droplets spraying out in all directions and catching the sunlight in an eerie, almost beautiful way. The rushing sound grew louder, deafening, and I could feel it vibrating through my chest. My heart pounded as I sat frozen in the boat, unable to look away. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something within the column, a dark shape, massive and indistinct, moving just beneath the surface. My mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing added up. My sister, who had been absorbed in her phone, ran to the edge of the dock, screaming for me to get out of the boat. Her voice was high-pitched, panicked, breaking through the strange, hypnotic trance that had held me in place. I scrambled to the edge of the boat and leapt onto the dock, nearly slipping in my rush to get away. Together, we bolted back toward the cabin, not stopping until we were inside, the door shut firmly behind us. My dad was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine, and looked up as we burst in. We told him everything about the anchor, the plume of water, the sound. I could barely get the words out, my sister chiming in with frantic nods and details. But he didn't believe us. He chuckled and shook his head, waving it off as a gas pocket or some natural phenomenon. "Lakes do weird things sometimes," he said. "You're just spooking yourselves." Frustrated, we insisted it wasn't normal, that it was too big, too strange to be something natural. But he wasn't convinced. "Go back and take a look," he said. "It's probably nothing." The next morning, after much hesitation, we did go back. The lake looked perfectly normal. The water was still and undisturbed, the kind of picturesque calm you'd see on a postcard. There was no sign of the eruption, no ripples, no discoloration. The only thing out of place was a faint dampness on the dock and nearby grass, as though water had sprayed further than it should have. The anchor was gone, of course, and the area where it had fallen gave no clues to what might have happened. My sister and I exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say much. There didn't seem to be any point. For years, I doubted myself. I replayed the event in my head, trying to rationalize it, to explain away the strange details. Could it have been a gas pocket, trapped beneath the lakebed and released when the anchor hit? But what about the sound, the towering column of water, the dark shape? None of it made sense. It felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, each theory raising more questions than answers. Eventually, I asked my sister about it, careful not to lead her with my own memories. "Do you remember that thing at the lake?" I asked casually. Her reaction was immediate. Her face darkened and she nodded. "Of course I do. How could I forget?" She described it almost exactly as I remembered. The trembling water, the enormous plume, the strange deafening sound. The only difference was that she hadn't seen me throw the anchor in. To her, it had seemed to come out of nowhere. "It was taller than me," she said, her voice quiet. "Way taller. It didn't feel right." Her confirmation unsettled me in a way I hadn't expected. I had hoped she would dismiss it, chalk it up to a shared childhood exaggeration, but she hadn't. Whatever we had seen, it wasn't a trick of memory. Over the years, I've tried to find similar stories, searching for anything that might explain what happened. There are accounts of underwater springs, gas pockets, and even creatures of the deep that might fit parts of the description, but nothing matches entirely. Sometimes I wonder if we disturbed something that was better left undisturbed, something ancient and hidden that returned to the depths as quickly as it had emerged. Whatever it was, I've never seen anything like it again, and I'm not sure I ever want to. Reddit. The morning of my grandfather's funeral was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that feels heavy, like the woods around you are holding their breath. My grandfather's logging trail, a place I'd walked countless times, stretched out in front of me, dappled with sunlight filtering through the well-trimmed trees. I had always loved this place, a sanctuary of towering pines and oaks with the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. But that day, it felt different. Maybe it was my own grief tinting the air, or maybe it was something else. I walked slowly, head down, scanning the ground for mushrooms. I'd been collecting them for years, a hobby that had earned me more than a few complaints from friends who hated my slow pace. But I didn't care. The delicate caps and intricate gills fascinated me, and today it was a welcome distraction. I stopped when I spotted a perfect little white cap, its edges smooth and unblemished, standing proudly in the soft moss. I crouched down, angling my phone to get a good picture. That's when I heard it. Thud. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling or a woodpecker hammering away at a trunk. It was deeper, more deliberate, like a fist punching solid wood. I froze, my body suddenly hyper-aware of the stillness around me. Thud. 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 The sound was rhythmic, unchanging, like a heartbeat echoing through the trees. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the woods in the direction of the noise. My grandfather had always kept the trees on his property well trimmed, and I could see out for at least 75 to 100 yards. There was nothing, no movement, no shadows darting between the trees, just the sound, steady and unrelenting. My first thought was deer. I'd heard them stomp to protect their young, and sometimes they'd rub their antlers against trees to mark territory, but this wasn't that. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds of deer, bear, moose, anything that lived in western Massachusetts. This was different. It sounded almost human, but heavier, meatier, like a massive fist pounding against bark. Curiosity won out over fear. I let out a sharp whistle, loud and distinct, one that couldn't be mistaken for a bird or random noise. The thudding stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, clear and unmistakable, I heard a whistle in return, low, quick, and deliberate. My stomach dropped. At that moment, I convinced myself it had to be a person, maybe some trespasser or logger scoping the land beyond the no trespassing gate. Ignoring the knot of unease tightening in my chest, I shouted, "Hey!" as loud as I could, my voice carrying through the woods. The reply wasn't what I expected. Whatever it was didn't answer. It ran. The sound of its footsteps was immediate and overwhelming, crashing through the underbrush with a speed and force that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a bear. I knew what four-legged animals sounded like when they ran, the uneven rhythm of their gait. This was two legs, heavy and frantic, moving faster than I thought anything on two legs could. Each step was loud, the weight of it shaking the ground slightly beneath my feet, and I could tell it was big, easily 250 pounds, if not more. I didn't wait to see what it was. My body took over, and I turned and bolted down the trail, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the property, the familiar outline of my grandfather's house coming into view. When I burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed, my family was in the kitchen, making final preparations for the funeral. They looked up in alarm, my mom rushing over to ask what was wrong. I tried to explain what had happened, stumbling over my words as I described the thudding, the whistle, the sound of something massive running through the woods. My uncle, who had grown up exploring the same trails, laughed it off. "Probably just a deer," he said, shaking his head. "You scared it and it bolted." "No," I said firmly, my voice shaking. "It wasn't a deer. It was running on two legs, and it was huge." "Maybe it was a bear," my dad offered, though he didn't sound convinced. I knew what I had heard, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to nerves, the stress of the day messing with my head. After a while, I stopped trying to explain. I didn't want to be the crazy one telling ghost stories at a funeral. But the memory stayed with me. That night, after the service, I lay awake in bed, replaying the events in my mind. The thudding, the whistle, the heavy, frantic footsteps. The way it had stopped when I whistled back, as though it understood. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something I wasn't supposed to. Something that didn't belong in the rational, explainable world. I started reading about Bigfoot sightings not because I believed, but because I needed answers. The descriptions people gave, the rhythmic knocking, the whistles, the sheer size of the creature, matched what I had experienced almost perfectly. Some accounts even mentioned the idea that Bigfoot had a spiritual connection to the forests it inhabited, an ability to sense the emotions and intentions of those who entered its territory. And I didn't know if I believed that, but the timing of it all, the fact that it had happened on the day of my grandfather's funeral, felt like more than coincidence. I haven't gone back to that trail since. My family still owns the property, and my uncle occasionally teases me about the Bigfoot incident, but I don't laugh along. Whatever I encountered that day, it wasn't a deer or a bear or anything else that I could explain. It was something bigger, something that left me questioning the boundaries of what we know about the world around us. Even now, when I'm out in the woods, I find myself listening more closely, paying attention to the sounds that others might ignore. I haven't heard the thudding again, and I hope I never do. But sometimes, when the forest is quiet and the air feels heavy, I think about that day and wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of what we understand. Redditor 10. It was a clear, crisp night, the kind where the stars feel impossibly close, sharp pinpricks of light in the black velvet sky. I was riding in the passenger seat of my dad's car, on our usual route from his house to my mom's. It was a drive I could practically map in my sleep, only about 15 minutes long, weaving through quiet suburban streets and a few stretches of open road. I'd made the trip countless times before, but for some reason, that night felt different. Maybe it was the stillness in the air or the way the stars seemed brighter than usual. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wasn't paying much attention to the road. My dad was humming along to an old rock station on the radio, his hands steady on the wheel. I leaned against the window, my gaze wandering upward, watching the stars as they slid past. There was something calming about it, losing myself in the vastness of the sky, imagining all the worlds out there, far beyond anything I could comprehend. We were approaching the roundabout when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a plane. 4 bright lights moving quickly across the sky, their glow sharp and steady. I stared at them, my mind automatically cataloging the usual explanations. But as I watched, I realized something was wrong. The lights were moving too quickly, faster than any plane I'd ever seen, cutting through the sky with a precision that didn't feel natural. "Dad?" I said, my voice quiet, uncertain. He didn't respond, focused on navigating the roundabout. The lights didn't follow a straight path like a plane would. They darted in strange, deliberate movements, changing direction so sharply it seemed impossible. One moment they were moving in unison, a tight formation streaking across the stars. Then, as if following some invisible signal, they split apart, veering in opposite directions before rejoining effortlessly. "Dad," I said again, louder this time. "Look at the sky." "What's up?" he asked, glancing at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. "What's wrong?" "They're lights," I said, pointing out the window. "They're just—" He gave a quick glance upward, but by the time he did, the lights had already shifted again. They moved in a way that made my stomach tighten, looping back on themselves in a motion that defied everything I knew about flight. They didn't slow down or curve like a bird or a drone might. They just stopped, reversed, and darted in a completely new direction, as if the laws of physics didn't apply to them. "Probably just a plane," my dad said, his tone dismissive. "It's not a plane," I insisted, my voice rising. "Planes don't move like that." He sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's probably a satellite or something. You're imagining things." I turned back to the window, frustration bubbling in my chest. The lights were still there, dancing across the sky in patterns I couldn't make sense of. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. No fading, no gradual dimming, just gone, as if they had never been there at all. I stared at the empty sky, my heart pounding. I felt like I'd just woken up from a dream, disoriented and questioning what I'd seen, but it hadn't been a dream. I knew what I'd seen. When we pulled into my mom's driveway, I tried again to explain it to my dad. I told him about the speed, the sharp changes in direction, the way the lights had vanished. He listened, nodding occasionally, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He probably thought I was making it up, or had misinterpreted something ordinary. "You're watching too much sci-fi," he said, with a chuckle as I got out of the car. Over the years, I've tried to tell the story to other people, friends, coworkers, even a couple of strangers at a party once. The reactions are always the same. Polite smiles, skeptical laughs, dismissive comments about planes, drones, or my imagination. "Are you sure it wasn't just a helicopter?" they'd ask. Or, "Maybe you saw shooting stars." But I know what I saw. Sometimes I try to rationalize it, to come up with explanations that fit within the realm of possibility. Maybe it was a drone, some high-tech model that could move faster and more precisely than anything I'd seen before. But would a drone be flying that high, in a formation of 4, at that speed? And what about the way they disappeared? Satellites don't just vanish, and planes don't loop back on themselves like that. The memory has stayed with me, sharp and clear, refusing to fade like most childhood recollections do. It wasn't just the lights themselves that unsettled me. It was the way they made me feel. For those few minutes, as I watched them cut through the sky, I felt like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to, something that didn't belong in the world I thought I knew. It was like glimpsing behind a curtain, seeing a fragment of something bigger, stranger, and completely beyond my understanding. I still find myself looking up at the night sky sometimes, scanning the stars for any sign of movement. Part of me hopes I'll see the lights again, just to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. But another part of me isn't so sure, because if I did see them again, what then? Would it make the world feel bigger or smaller? Would it answer my questions or just raise more? No one believes me, and maybe they never will, but I know what I saw. 4 lights moving too quickly, too deliberately, too impossibly to be anything ordinary. Whatever they weren't planes. Redditor 11. Working as a field biologist, you get used to strange nights in the middle of nowhere. The job takes you to the most remote corners of the country, places where civilization feels like a distant memory. Last summer in Wyoming, I had what I'd call the strangest experience of my life, one I still can't fully explain. We were out tracking prairie chickens, which involves driving around on ATVs all night, shining spotlights into the vast, open prairie to locate them. It's repetitive, solitary work, punctuated by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of the wind through the grass. That particular night, I was paired with my boss, while the rest of our team worked another site about 5 miles away. The plan was simple. If either group finished early, we'd meet up to compare notes and head back to camp together. The hours dragged on as they usually did. The night was moonless, and the only light came from our spotlights cutting through the darkness. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of grass under a star-speckled sky. It was beautiful in its own way, but also unsettling, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the only two people left in the world. It was around 4 a.m. when we noticed something strange. My boss and I were scanning a hilltop across from us, and we both stopped at the same time, our spotlights aimed at the ground. The grass on the far side of the hill was illuminated, glowing faintly, as if someone had parked a truck on the other side and turned on their brights. "Is that them?" I asked, my voice breaking the heavy silence. My boss frowned, squinting in the direction of the light. "Maybe," he said. "Looks like it's coming from where the trucks are parked." We decided to head over. The hill was about a mile away, and the ride there felt longer than it should have. The ATVs buzzed loudly in the quiet night, the headlights bouncing as we navigated the uneven terrain. The light on the hill remained steady, glowing faintly as if it were waiting for us. When we finally crested the hill, our engines rumbling to a stop, I felt my stomach drop. There was no truck, no headlights, nothing. The hilltop was empty, the grass undisturbed. In the distance, the reflectors on our parked trucks gleamed faintly under the starlight, exactly where we'd left them. The light we'd seen was gone. My boss and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the unease in his expression. "Did you see where it went?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. It was just here." We scanned the area with our spotlights, turning slowly in a circle to make sure we hadn't missed anything. The prairie was empty, stretching out endlessly in every direction. It was impossible for someone to have driven a truck in and out of the area without us seeing or hearing them. The land was so flat and open that any movement would have been visible for miles. "Maybe it was some kind of reflection," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The light had been too distinct, too deliberate. It wasn't the soft glow of moonlight or the diffuse shimmer of distant stars. It had been bright and focused, like headlights or a spotlight lighting up the grass with an unnatural clarity. My boss didn't respond. He just sat there for a moment, staring into the darkness, his hand resting on the handlebars of his ATV. Finally, he sighed and said, "Let's head back." The ride to the trucks was silent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the light again, but the hill remained dark. By the time we reached the vehicles, the unease had settled into a dull, persistent buzz in the back of my mind. When we met up with the rest of the team later that morning, we told them about the light. They laughed it off, joking about aliens and ghost trucks, but I could tell neither of us was in the mood to join in. The more we thought about it, the less sense it made. There were no nearby roads, no campfires, no possible explanation for the light we'd seen. I tried to rationalize it over the next few days. Maybe it had been a reflection, or a trick of the light, or some weird atmospheric phenomenon. But none of those explanations fit. The light had been too deliberate, too distinct. And the fact that it disappeared the moment we got close made it feel intentional, like it didn't want to be found. I don't consider myself a superstitious person. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that nature can be strange and unpredictable, but this was different. It felt wrong. Like we'd stumbled onto something we weren't meant to see. Months later, I still think about that night. The image of the glowing grass, the emptiness of the hilltop, the way my boss's voice sounded when he said, "Let's head back." It wasn't fear exactly, but there was a weight to it, a shared understanding that whatever we'd experienced was beyond us. I've read stories about strange lights in the wilderness, UFO sightings, will-o'-the-wisps, even ball lightning, but nothing matches what we saw. It wasn't in the sky. It wasn't distant or fleeting. It was there, right in front of us, and then it wasn't. Sometimes, when I'm out in the field late at night, I catch myself scanning the horizon, looking for that light. Part of me hopes I'll never see it again, but another part of me, the part that still can't let go of that night, wonders what would have happened if we'd stayed just a little longer.